Welcome to the Cascadia Poetry Festival. My name is Paul Nelson. I run a nonprofit called SPLAB, which stands for Seattle Poetics Lab. And this is the launch of the book, The Samthology, which is right here. This is where you cheer wildly.
Louder.
It's like the sitcoms where they applause, right? I want to acknowledge that we're on the ancestral homeland of the Samish, Swinomish, Tulalip, Lummi, and other coastal Salish tribes. We recognize that, we mention that as often as we can, and I love the way that Stephen Collis talked about it last night, feeling like a lifelong visitor to this, or guest was the word he used, to this place. So we want to recognize that and put this in the proper perspective. Some of the sponsors to make this event and the Samthology happen include the City of Anacortes Lodging Tax Fund. And I want to say that the people of Anacortes, the Arts Commission, and the city have been helpful since the very moment I suggested we do this. So I would like to give them a hand at this time to show our appreciation. Because if they don't get on board, it doesn't happen. The Washington State Arts Commission, Arts WA, Ian Boyden, Cascadia College, and there were several Cascadia College students here participating in the living room and hanging out and hopefully having their minds blown. Copper Canyon Press, Martin Espada for help with the Samthology, the Fidalgo Culture Foundation, Knox Gardner and Victor Trudnovsky, Marius Hibbard, How It Works, thank you Chris Terrell, Humanities Washington, Middle Point Press, Kim Miller for support of the Samthology. There she is, Kim, thank you. Pleasure Boat Studio, where's Lauren? There's Lauren, waving high, drinking and selling books at the break. Poets and Writers, Stanley and Risha Saber for support of the Samthology. The Subud International Cultural Association, SICA, USA. Without SICA, this festival does not happen. I'll let you know that because the person who connected us to the powers that be in Anacortes is a Subud brother. And I'm grateful for him, his contribution, his connections, and also his suggestion that we use this space. This is an incredible space, and we're very grateful to be putting this on here. I also want to thank our sound man and archivist, Leopoldo, who came here and is doing this and is going to get it online on YouTube using my account. So you can see how much I trust him. And he runs the CMP Poetry Bridge series at CMP Coffee House in West Seattle on the second Wednesday of the month. It's an open mic, so go there and enjoy that. I also want to again thank the SPLAB board for making this stuff go and the key volunteers. So thank you so much. Sam Hamill, we're going to have 7 people reading tonight, and then we're going to have a break, and then we're going to have the after party, which is a very energetic affair where poets get up and read one poem and get off the stage. How many poems, Matt? 1 poem, that's right. Okay. Because 1 is the number that comes before 2. So let me read 1 poem. All right, and so in order, I will read one of the poems I have in the Samthology. Thomas Pruiksma, Elizabeth Cooperman, Michael Daly, Jayne Merek, Tim McNulty, and then Ian Boyden will close the show. I did this cover poem. I took Rex Roth's letter to William Carlos Williams, and I took out William Carlos Williams and put Sam Hamill, and took out his other images and put in my images. And so Sam said that was a trick that he used. It's interesting how we both cheat the same way. Letter to Sam Hamill. Dear Sam, when I searched the past for you, you'd not be Basho sleeping next to pissing horses or Levi dead drunk reaching for the full moon's reflection. You can rarely see the Cascadia moon, and you're more a sea guy than a man about rivers. Leave that for Sund and the cult. More measured than falling for that old reflection trick, though his moon lunge might have been the equivalent of Kevorkian in Tongue Era Xi'an, and the boots remain muddy. How Rex Roth's alive inside you, the first guy here looking east. I think about how you love to tell stories and I'm always happy to set you up. Take Long Tall Dexter at Centrum. They're going to play scales even if they're the master class. How that phrase reverberates with the unwillingness to humble oneself. Ah, Port Townsend. Will you visit there after your last taste of cold Otokoyama, return as a whisper in the poplars of Cape George, or leading the Congress of Trees? We're still digesting your last will and testimony, your final habitation. I thought it was your Zen golf concentration with which you screamed out backswing distractions, but no, just your hearing aid turned off. How at Avalon you'll watch the eagles know a baby eagle as it flies overhead while you shoot for birdies after a good drive, or settle for a layup and take your bogey like a man. Nowadays, 4,000 Facebook friends will keep your keyboard chattering about fracking, Guantanamo, bigots, parades, modern-day McCarthy's, outsized CEO's pay, or Rachel Corrie, mixed in with a dash of the masters. Strive to be a poet of modest renown, taking Kuan Yin over Christ for Christ's sake. Happy with cold Momokawa. How you'd say in an interview, you could do the Kevorkian, not in so many words, your last poems of the melancholic, but if generosity be love, your love studies paid back abundant. And there'll be stories galore, maybe the Zen boot camp you ran, called a writer's workshop, and continued resentment from the dilettante periphery you'd warn about over and over, having felt their wrath. They who'd envy you, want a photo with you, but not want the 5 a.m. wake-ups in strange languages, or how they court the company of dabblers to approximate the feelings of masters, the lifelong shortcuts you refuse to take. In death, you'll be a wise-ass raven above the ferns and moss, urging a poet yet to be with a perfect 7-beat image, then gone, a blur of black in one of 100 avenues of gray across the sky, as we hunker down for life without that irascible orphan who lived it all as a sacramental relationship that lasts always, always urging us to live as if we'll be measured by stone. With love and gratitude, Paul Nelson.
Yeah.
If you have a cell phone on in your pocket and it's going to emit a noise, please either turn off the sound or set it to stun. The first panel both panels were absolutely amazing, and I was not expecting the intimacy and the power of the first panel. I was really blown away by it. And the person who kicked that off is coming up here next. Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma is an author, poet, translator, teacher, magician, musician, and lover of life. He was born in Seattle. That's what a native looks like. Has worked in South India and Southern Mexico and is currently a 2018-2019 NEA Translation Fellow. Earlier this year, Marrowstone Press published his first collection of poems, The Safety of Edges. Other books include Give, Eat, and Live, poems of Avayar, and Body and Earth with the artist C.F. John. Pruiksma performs nationally and internationally, serves as language consultant for the Cozy Grammar series of video courses. He makes his home on Vashon Island with his husband, David Mielke. His website is thomaspruiksma.com. Please welcome Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma.
And thanks to all of you for being here and sticking it out to the great celebration at the end. So I'm going to read 3 poems, the first of which is the poem in the Samthology called Habitation. A letter for Sam Hamill. Sam, I've been living in Habitation, your book of living poems, and I'm struck like a bell how completely you've lived your vow. You have made a life in service to a temple, not of money or of power, or worse yet, of prestige, but of words spoken simply, having come to that grace. so that they mean exactly what they say. You have been a monk and fool, because we have to be fools to keep thriving in this world with its deadly imitations. Words abused everywhere to mean nothing, which is everything, when everything is meant to be sold. As the things of the marketplace circulate among thieves, you've given away treasures, songs for all seasons sung in true measures, showing us one way to open our hearts, free for a moment of self and of suffering. All that disturbs us, you once wrote in a poem, can be felt, absorbed, and finally transcended by the act of listening to that deepest voice speaking from within. That's why you have found the right name for your book, this record of your life and your habit of deep listening, which has been your monk's robes, your practice and precept, your way of perception that makes it all new and makes you all new, no longer a creature, but creator of habit, living the epiphany we find in the poem wherein all is music, is light. And two poems from The Safety of Edges. Two poems that seemed fitting for Cascadia and festivity. Sabbath. As night falls on Sunday, the floor swept, the rug clean, I can almost imagine the whole world at peace, without oceans drying out, whole peoples disappearing, fire and smoke rising as we race to the finish, where all that we know will be finished. How can one sleep in peace? And yet we must sleep to keep rising awake, able to walk and work another way, where resting at evening as the sun falls away is peace, is enough, is a world in itself, working to be whole once more. And this last poem is a tribute to my friend, the poet Hayden Carruth, who ties me to Sam in more than one way, because one of the first books of Hayden's that I read before I knew Hayden personally was his Selected Essays and Reviews, which is an extraordinary book and is not as well known as I think it ought to be. And the cover of that book is a beautiful snowy scene, which I imagined, a little naively I suppose, was his rural Vermont, where he spent many years and wrote many extraordinary poems. But in fact, it was Sam and Gray's place in Port Townsend, looking out from the porch. And when they were putting together, when Sam was putting the book together, they said, "What should we do for the cover?" He said, Hayden said, "I like looking out from your porch." And there was a picture Gray had taken looking out from the porch in winter. And so that ended up on the cover. So I was looking at a place that I would go to be in from time to time before I knew I would go to be in it. Anyway, this is a poem for and about Hayden. "Write a poem," said Hayden, "about Hayden Carruth, who had sat now for hours, drinking and talking, listening to the things I said. An hour, I had thought, maybe 2 at the most. But as the winds began blowing, the talk kept flowing. "So, Tom," he said, hands on the table, "what should we have for dinner?" Joanne made filet mignon, which I hadn't had in years. And as we finished, he said, "Where's my birthday cake?" Joanne looked at me slantwise and shook her head. It wasn't his birthday at all. But she happened to have cake, and served it with ice cream, and lit a single candle in each piece. We sang for the heck of it and ate. Joanne said, "Hayden, you are always making up stories," even though he admitted later that they were true. "Well, Hayden," she answered, "you're always making up facts," which he also acknowledged soon enough. We spoke of the origins of Pruiksma and Caruth, and how hard it is to say with any certainty. Nobody really knows," he said. We spoke of other poets, living and dead, staying up till the winds blew away my departure, and still his mind moved like a fox. "A man is like a house," he said, coming from the toilet. "The first thing to go is the plumbing." Later, when Joanne had gone up to bed, he looked at me chin-table and said in a voice that I knew from his poems, "I've been wrong so many times, and she's been right so many times, it makes her into an ogre." And he stopped, as I did, hearing the word ogre, but only to catch his short breath. "Pruiksma," he said. "Pruiksma, Pruiksma. That's a good name for an ogre." Such was his poem about ogres and friends, sung as the winds whipped round their house, and I sat without speaking, without lifting my glass, hoping the gale would never end. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm reminded of a couple on Wickenish Island, indigenous couple. The subject of relationships came up, and he said, the male of the couple, he said, "I always get the last word in our relationship, and it's yes, dear." So I remembered. The Samthology got a lot of help from a lot of people, including two people who could not be here tonight because of conflicts. One, something about a cruise to Alaska that she was on the waiting list for and came through. But I believe Kate Gable when she tells me stuff like that. And also Lynn Coffin, who is a proofreader extraordinaire. So thank you, Lynn and Kate, and we're thinking about you. Our next poet, I'll read the bio here from Make It True, hoping it's current. Después de haber vivido y enseñando en la ciudad eterna. Maybe I'll just read it in English. After living and teaching in the eternal city, Elizabeth Cooperman co-wrote a poetic guide to Rome, The Last Mosaic, with Thomas Walton on a press called Sagging Meniscus. And then the book is over there. You can get it. You can relate to that. Is it the link? She is co-editor with David Shields of the anthology Life is Short, Art is Shorter, and has been artist in residence at the Ragdale Foundation residency in Chapala, Mexico, and she's the art director at Pageboy magazine, and she's here to read some Marilyn Hacker. Please welcome Elizabeth Cooperman.
Well, I'm going to tell you who Marilyn Hacker is to start off with. Marilyn Hacker is the author of 14 books of poems, including Blazons, A Stranger's Mirror, and Names, and an essay collection, Unauthorized Voices. Her 16 translations of French and Francophone poets include Venus Clurigata's A Handful of Blue Earth, and Emmanuel Moses's Preludes and Fugues. She lives in Paris. So she's quite an accomplished poet and translator. And I will do my best to translate this work, which is it's from something called A Day Book, and it's actually it's a poem written in the spirit of Sam Hamill. So translation on multiple levels. In winter, the produce on the stalls is rufous roots, dark leaves, luminous tubers, as if earth voided jewels from its bowels for my neighbor's Sunday stew pots. Concurrent ruckus calls and odors waft among the vegetables. Merguez sizzles in a skillet, fowl turn on a row of spits. Damp dogs prowl between wool-stockinged calves and corduroys, tissue-wrapped clementines from Morocco, gold from old colonies, saltfish from Portugal and Spain's olives and oil, cauliflower from Brittany, also the channel-crossing mist of rain down from the northwest coast since yesterday. Thought thrusts up, homely as a hyacinth wrapped in its bulb like a vegetable root, a 9-month belly, while the green indelible patterns inscribed into the labyrinth, lanced into light, its air's inhabitant, with light and air as food and drink. A hyacinth, tumescent pink, on the low wooden Mexican chest, confronts the wintry dusk with informed self-interest. Leaf spears extravagantly ask what idea, still gnarled up in a knot of ganglions, will break through the husk, shaped at last, recognizable as thought, trace on a city map, trajectories of partially forgotten words along the river's arteries, volatile substance of a sentient world. Mauve heather crowds the window grill. The light lingers a little later with a slight vernal inflection. In a moon-glazed vase bloom yellow freesias, like some rainy day's brook bank in someone else's memory. Small whirlpools of perception widen, ring an infant's numinous discoveries of syllables for animals, toys, trees, a lab's thick coat, the dusty birds in Claremont Park, each tardy urban spring, a stuffed pink leather horse with button eyes. Grief, pain, and sorrow, all are la douleur, while la bonheur is simple happiness, which we savored in the hour, seized as the solstice passed across the heather-misted calendar, whose olive-brown hillocks' December blur was pierced by the setting sun as we meandered, vigneron to vigneron, wellspring to orchard, stopped for Le Monde, for the view, pleasure both cumulative and abrupt, sudden, suave vista, beauty we knew, mist imperceptibly becoming rain, well enough to recall while going through the nuances of sorrow, grief, and pain. Grasp and turn a moment, make it stop, stand in view like the freesias in their green moon with arboreal ribs. A lapsed monk worked the Burgundian clay he'd learned, cloistered, to turn and slap, fire and glaze. While he talked, wet clay dripped down his bare arms. The moment turns like clay slip on a wheel, or burns with sweetness like the potter's clover honey offered to us as we move with the wrapped box back into the rainy winter morning. He told me he read Henry Miller, then rethought his vows. 6 months out of chemotherapy, I heard his daughters singing in the house. What are the engines of that energy? A path around a vineyard, sandwiches and Starbucks coffee above the Hudson, a long kiss, 5 flights of wooden stairs, worn slant by 3 centuries' footsteps, an old library book with bracketed sentences may make the metamorphosis to firm words from memory's shift and slip, the way the moistened clay, turned and handled on the wheel, whirled up and swelled into the belly of a vase, and curved out to the flower-implicit lip. The movement is the potter's, not the clay's. A flaw, and he aborts it with a slap. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth Cooperman. It's not easy to read someone else's work, and I'm grateful that Marilyn is represented, and Kate Gable again made that happen, which is excellent. Our next reader is a retired Mount Vernon high school teacher. Shows he has courage. His work has appeared in Plowshares, Hudson Review, Rhino, Seattle Review, APR, and elsewhere. His 5th collection of poetry, True Heresies, is forthcoming from Cervena Press this year. He lives near Deception Pass, right over here, so a local. And I just have to say that I was reminded when I read Andrew Schelling's book on the life of Jaime D'Angulo that this guy was there at the beginning of bioregionalism here in this state, in this bioregion, the hotbed of it in Port Townsend. And his presence and the presence of one other reader tonight who also was here since the very beginning and have added so much to our understanding of what it is like to practice as a Cascadian. His presence, their presence here makes me realize we're doing some things right. So please welcome Michael Daly.
Bring out your dead. Bring out your dead.
I'm not dead yet!
I'm pretty close. Way back in 1980 or 81, I was working for a guy named Carl in downtown Boston as his laborer in a construction site. And then all of his employees walked off the job. And he got another job in downtown Boston and hired me to be his foreman. So within a month, I rose to the top of my profession. Then I hired Tim McNulty to help us work at this. And we would frequently need some Irish stout at the end of the day. And we would go to the Plough and the Stars. And we discussed and we discussed our old friend, Sam Hamill, back in Port Townsend. And so this is a poem called Letter from Boston, which I wrote to Sam. And I guess it's more about my own experience being sort of, even though I'm from Boston, sort of out of my element while I was there. Letter from Boston. Sam, the 3rd renovation in a row the crew walked off today. Nothing gets finished, just abandoned. But the job leaves splinters. Lifting a stout at the plow, your name came up. Tim read a poem about quitting this hard-hat economy by a guy from the Tetons, frozen fence posts, and the usual, snow, hardened compost, wood smoke, a line from time to time that missed the beat, because we stay too long within the rhythms of the trades. The body beside me sleeps like a machine. Breath noises, inward murmur, a moan within the dream. Romance, the illusion of the mirror, Cocteau's door to hell. Who cares about Eurydice? We can't ever come quite to rest. In a photo of Auden's face, cigarette smoke blurs all those creases, a river's unraveling away from rope. I won't describe the face I saw tonight on the subway. Hours later, I'm still confused and ashamed. We're anonymous enough out here, but this face, charred by all our poisons, I forced my eyes to believe we were born in the same place, drink the same water, run a palm across the same chrome and granite. In the rattling seats, most of us show no longing. A creased brow, and I look toward the window where my own face blackens, passing underground, brake lights flowering on the tunnel wall. When the train lurches, I get out and walk into the city. A thin Vietnamese in woman's slippers shivers in the draft below a vent. Not far away, a heavens made from turrets and old tiles. The perishable order of doorways. A man asleep on a stoop where someone's placed a withered carrot. Past shadow and streetlight at the quarry entrance, slate and granite veined, whorled, chopped, routed, and eroded by a stream or shoe and wheel. These roads of lichen, algae, oldest mosses, oak, and bowers of elm. In Munich, Aschenbach, before he fell in love as the boy ushered him toward death, passed a place like this and smelled the coming war. Headstones harvested here line up blank. To me, a young and foolish optimist, they're shouting, "We resist, we resist, we resist you." I was a boy full of milk and loved the wind veering down. The summer my hand took form from an arrow. Pines fanned one another in a field. My forearm sore before the bowstring, the first shots fell into New Hampshire, but then grinded one after another, unlike any bird, twanged against the straw bag of bullseyes. A hawk above the boughs brushed small loops of haze. I'm not sure why I wrote you this letter. I walked in black fields, and animals called me a man. Nostalgia, Rexroth said, in that way he has of instilling syllables, as if carving them on a maple whose leaves in the clear basin beside his camp sing the history of every word. But it's not that. Try this. I'm driving with the family on a typical Thursday, passing a lake. I want to have a look. Grandmother objects, but I pull over anyway, and the noises stop. No ripples. A birch stand fills with dusk. Sky turns to chalk. I set the bow. How green this lichen. Fieldstone walls have served 100 families, each more indifferent than the rest, but I draw the bow. Can't waste a shot. Arrow feathers leave my hand. The shaft disappears then, bone white. Arcs over the hawk's tail and falls back down to me, craning my neck to watch. You know, Sam, I was thinking about this after this morning's panel, where I think probably more of us experienced memories, at least, of a dark side. And it's probably fair to say he was admittedly a very ambitious man. Didn't let it be a secret that he wanted to be a great poet and a great publisher, and yet he was who he was, you know. But I think, you know, bearing that in mind, when I showed him poems, this is when I knew him back in the 70s, if I were to show him a poem, he would nod and say something, maybe even make a little remark. But the one time that he really, I think, made a positive remark is when that sort of sense of ambition also kicked in with his deepest kindness. I wish I had written that. I don't know how many times he said that, but it was the kind of thing that makes you think 5 different ways at the same time. You know? So I'd like to read one more poem that I don't know if Sam ever read this. I sent him this book twice and never heard whether he read it or not. This is, I suppose, more about the Poets Against the War. This is a poem about war. My father was a warrior, and he participated in the firebombing of Tokyo. I didn't find this out until after he died. I opened a drawer in his house, and there was a newspaper clipping that said, on this date, these things happened. And the date, I think it was March 12th, was circled with a note that said, I was there, which is the only way I ever found out. The Firestorm starts off with a quote from Robert McNamara. By the way, there's a footnote. This book needed, for some reason, many pages of footnotes. I think I'll read the footnote before I read the poem. The footnote to this poem, the late Robert McNamara's epigraph is quoted from the movie The Fog of War. Unlike prosecutors of war during the Bush administration, both General Curtis LeMay, who's responsible for the firebombing of Tokyo, and Robert McNamara said that had their respective missions turned out differently, they should have been found guilty of war crimes.
Ain't that the truth?
The Firestorm. Was there a rule then to say that you shouldn't bomb, shouldn't kill, shouldn't burn to death 100,000 civilians in a single night? Robert McNamara. One match, scrape it over the tablet. Flame takes no form. When no one remembers, history ends. The Stone Age is fire's hope. A fire in the lips, for love is, for fever so burns. A fire of the brain, its lopsided droop burst at the gas jet. The hair a flame, head a candle tip. The body's wildfire, heartburn to hemorrhoid, footsole to fingertip, desire till the ash in the urn. The city of Tokyo is the heartless anatomy of a man, the invention of authority, a fine blade whipped through cartilage, mind irrelevant. Thus, American history swept Japan. Ghost dancers set aflame, Yankees who overcame heredity and learned to scalp, now called psychotic anomalies, My Lai, Fallujah's firestorms, and Baltimore's cowpokes and reverends invented the good. I heard a hum inside, a propeller pulse in aging brains. Then there were ribbons of dark on the emperor's roof, wings, scissored wings, a black quilt of bombers. I folded the flaps of both my ears like wallets. At Kinchi Park, an electric pole glowed, stones beside luggage. Identity? Whose identity? A cartoon mouse clutches the pole on Swiss Cheese Street. His inside-out umbrella spreads its branches from a J-handled root. He plants in the flower pot he's sketching on the air, and the two gloved paws hold on, horizontal legs stretching toward the gigantic vacuum cleaner. First one shoe, then the other, suctioned away, and each of the toe-ripped socks then pathetically grabs for the belt on flyaway mousy trousers, lets go the street pole to cover his shame with both four-finger gloves, and after a mimed plea to us once for compassion, shwoom, into the wind tunnel, vacuum, or nostril of snoring Leviathan. The firestorm is like that. Mutatis mutandis, the mouse is me. history, the flaming tornado, what number sucked into what flame. On the ground, no faces. In the air, no names. Below, only fire. Above, wings. Above the city are wings with men who stand around a fire in each of the B-29s. In silhouette, their uniforms seem rags, as if blanketed winos circle a scorched steel drum. By the furry ridge of shoulders and helmeted, they could be grim crusaders hurling torched bales at heathens, or Achaeans readying arrow tips, home fires already wept, or they are first people who hunt and warm in seasons before Prometheus. Stone grunts watch cities burn, flying so low the awful scent and heat crackle upward. Dad said flak came into the Bombay doors. How did the moon swim to the lips of the cedar? I am waist deep in a pool of fog, and still I can see her candle torch the treetops. I didn't know that city they boiled alive, where women in air raid turbans moved like wicks of candles. But I knew my father, who was up too high to notice the wind suck them into flames. I was a child when he packed his suitcase. Why have I wrapped my life around his? Just as moon clung to earth, so did I. A tree rooted in complacency, shading buds, frozen in the shock of spring on a coastal bluff. I thought the world was an ocean crossed by cruise ships, lugging the cargo of state through squalls. Common decency would always douse the embers of cities. But I was wrong, again, a life wrong. Sometimes people who jump from windows do hold hands, or plummet from burning bridges to clot an inflamed river. Moonlight glazes the picnic table, mines the deep blades of sleeping grass, drapes the womanly boughs in silver, washed by that distant, distracted fire. I could believe a love that guides the moon. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for the testimony. It's Sam's story. I was at Sam's house in December, and his daughter was there. She was telling us the plans for the house, which she has sold, so it won't be Sam's house after this weekend. She said a part of the closing agreement was they get to use the Sam's house for the fest as sort of a base camp. And I said, what did you ever do with that Bill Slater painting of the eggs in the cast iron skillet? Well, earlier we were talking about how she's building a house on the Shuswap River. So me, the smart ass, says, I wear it size 9.5, Shuswap, ha ha ha. Anyway, she said, asked her about the painting, and she said, well, I'm not sure. Why don't you come over here? We went into the studio, which is a cement floor, and she said, your feet must be freezing. What size shoe did you wear? Say you wear? I said, 9.5. She says, try these on. I tried on Sam's shoes, and I was wearing them all winter long. So they say walk a mile in a man's shoes, and I've been counting my steps, so it's several miles. And 3 pairs of shoes. I got brown ones, the black ones, and like sandals. So it's pretty wild to have that. There's going to be more Sam stories tonight. Next we have a reader reading someone else's work from the Samthology, which will be for sale after the reading there, before the after party. Jayne Merek, Professor Emerita of English, with a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. She also earned an MFA from the University of Notre Dame, or as we say in Chicago, Notre Dame. She now makes her home in Port Townsend, where she writes, does photography, and learns about natural history. In fact, she's been nominated, shortlisted for the Ryan R. Gibbs Photography Contest. Her newest collection is entitled The Tree Surgeon, Dreams of Bowling. Please welcome Jayne Merek.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's hard to follow Michael Daly under any circumstances, but thank you for your wisdom. Thank you also for saying that you sent Sam 2 copies of your book. I sent him a copy of my first book, In and Out of Rough Water. Never heard back. He just said, yes, I'd be happy to have that. So I imagine it took its place suitably among those stacks and piles and shelves of books that surely we all have, and no doubt were in Sam's life all the way. I'd like to think of these poems as not a corrective, but as a balance for the more challenging pieces that we hear, especially what we just heard from Michael. Almost like the smooth stones that we find on the shore near Port Townsend, along, the coasts. Those stones that started out with many edges and ended up rolling their way to where they are now. They won't stay there, but they're smoothed. These are smoother poems. I'm grateful to Kate Gable. I'm going to read 2 of her pieces. And initially, Paul and I had talked about, should I read the French version of Alexis Bernot's poem? And then I thought, well, if enough people have a drink in their hands, we could play a drinking game for all the mispronunciations, because I don't use my French very much. But I don't think enough people have. Thank you very much. Thank you. I see we have some encouragement happening, but I think I will skip that because the poem in English is so nicely rendered, we might as well have that. So first, we'll start with the what I imagine is that last trip to France. Paris, July 1st, 2016, letter to Sam. Is that the last trip that he took? To France, yeah, that's what I thought. And this, of course, is Kate's poem. You're strapped into your seat at 30,000 feet of lofty air while I stir in Paris on Rue Orfila to sounds of children on the stair. Your sparse white beard and haggard face, once imagined, last night over cold sake was grizzled. You stroke your new beard, test its might, and fill our cups to the level line, kampai. We sip and laugh, we ate so well. Sitting every day alone. Our fate is sorting fragments to find the pearl in hand, while the moon, still teasing, tempts our hearts. If only I were beautiful, you young. For now, an empty house on a hill and a glimpse of the bay is not enough. What other horizon falters into view? Truth, you say, never ends, though it's more difficult to voice as the ship pulls from the dock, no land in sight, and a phantom oarsman or woman goads the clock. The beast slows inevitably, taps a small tattoo. What have we wasted? There's doubt at the back of the tongue where bitterness resides. Haste, haste, bow down as every human thing we've shaped goes to hell. Except for one line, scribbled on a wall somewhere, I loved her well. Miłość and Hamill. Nakagawa means middle of the river, Sam tells me, in Paris, scribbling kanji on a napkin at the round table of the Japanese cafe. The middle of the river is where the rocks are tossed up by spring freshet, their sad faces left bare, or where deep currents carry them home. It's either the unattainable or the edible earth, the tussle of two great minds, one who knows the secret if it exists, and one who will. We move to Alexis Bernot. Drinking at sundown. Is everyone ready? In English. To Sam Hamill on his 74th birthday. We're drunk again tonight, and I think of us in France, in Dordogne at sunset. We're drinking red wine by the river. I mention Ogerius, of whom you've never heard of. I think of us again, this time in Brittany, where I'm beginning a new life, where you won't come visit. It is sunset again. On the beach at Montserrat, and barnacle geese call from behind the horizon. And I think again, as we're drinking too much, of all those places where we will not be together, because your health will not allow it, because reality will not have it that way. I think of us as kids in the darkness, who imagine worlds and tell each other stories to stay awake, born on the edge of the world, on the feathers of their whispers, as they promise each other to never grow old. Thank you.
Thanks, Jayne. Nice work. I interviewed a Chinese-American poet, Zhang Er, a few weeks ago. Put it on my landing page for my interviews. And it was the day before the first anniversary of Sam's death. And one of the first questions I asked her was, and I heard her tell the story at Margin Shift about getting in touch with Sam Hamill. I guess it would have been in March of last year. And she said, I should ask Sam Phillip for a blurb, as many people did. And as I did, and I got one. It's on the back of my Slaughter book. And she thought, I don't know if he's going to remember me. We did an anthology 10 years ago. And so she says, what do I got to do? So you can say no. So she sends him an email. He responds within 48 hours. And he says, yes, I can do this. And she wasn't sure what he meant by that, but she was happy to get the blurb. And he gave the blurb, and about 2 weeks later he died. So that kind of tells you something about Sam. Blurbing to the end. But also his generosity. And the book is incredibly beautiful. It's about death rituals in the old village in China of her grandparents who were reburied in the old village, and her parents who were secular Marxists who went along with it, but they won't get that same treatment. Really interesting book. I've also interviewed our next poet, who's also, this is, I think, his third Cascadia Poetry Festival. I think he was at #1 in Columbia City, and the one where it was a tribute to Levertov, and he's here again tonight. So he must be doing something right. He wouldn't be keep coming back. Tim McNulty is a poet, an essayist, a conservation activist, a nature writer. Was born and grew up in Connecticut. He attended Northeastern University and UMass in Boston. There he met the poet Denise Levertov, who inspired him with her powerful fusion of visionary poetics and political activism. He ended up on the Olympic Peninsula in 1972, where he lives with his wife Mary Morgan, there in the foothills of the Olympic Mountains above the Dungeness and Grey Wolf rivers. Has helped protect a lot of, not the Olympic National Park, but nearby areas from the rampant clear-cutting, which is happening just about everywhere else in the peninsula that wasn't nailed down by people like him. His book on the natural history of Olympic National Park is now in its 4th edition. He might know the Olympics better than any human being alive, and he's a brilliant poet, and he's here again tonight. Please welcome Tim McNulty.
It's just me. In 1974, Sam and Tree came to Port Townsend from Denver, as Bill told us all about. And Port Townsend, that time was, a bunch of country hippies, a few boat bums. Sam arrived, cowboy hat, cowboy boots, big belt buckle. It was an awkward fit, and a further awkward fit because, you know, myself, Michael, everybody, the poets around there, we were these Buddhist nature poets. Sam was a Confucian, very, very kind of hardcore Confucian at that time. He was a champion of Pound. We'd all kick Pound out the door after, just right after the Chinese translations, including Pound's economic theories. It was, you know, kind of my relationship with Sam didn't get off on the greatest foot. But we did have a great love and shared regard for Kenneth Rexroth. Kenneth was, of course, probably helped save Sam's life at one point. Later, both Bill and Sam studied with Kenneth. Way down the line, Copper Canyon Press published Kenneth's complete works. One of the great gifts of, I think, of poetry publishing in America. Still in print, still just recently reissued. So that kind of shared mutual regard brought us together. And so I wanted to kind of celebrate this anthology with a poem that Sam wrote for a similar tribute anthology to Kenneth Rexroth. It was published by the Ark in New York, 1980, I think. And so I wanted to read just part of this poem. It's called To Kenneth Rexroth. The beginning of the poem kind of establishes the setting. It's winter solstice. Sam's outdoors. Orion's in the sky. It's cold. And he remembers what Kenneth said to William Carlos Williams about a poet as one who creates sacramental relationships that last always. A theme that I think he continued to develop over his life and his writings for Rexroth. This is, the poem picks up, I think it's also a little bit of a bioregional poem because it reaches out to Kenneth Rexroth's time in the Northwest. Rexroth came to the Northwest. It was his first place he landed when he came west from Chicago. And if you wanted to read a great Cascadian poem by Rexroth, a poem called A Living Pearl.
Oh, God.
Is a beautiful poem about the North Cascades when he was working as a packer and trail hand. It's a magnificent poem, beautiful love poem. It's heartbreaking. Anyway, so Sam picks this up. Far to the south, the moon pruned the tips of Olympic cedars, then slipped into snowy hills. In this land you roamed so many years ago. On this coast where you loved your grief away, huddled near a fire on the cold beach at Claylock, under the floating shadows of wooden sculptures carved by the broad hands of the sea. We are at peace in this world where the dirty hands of industry find us too poor to exploit. Again and again, in this season, it's bitter cold. I savor the sacrament of your poems. Always the warm shadows of campfires linger on, odors of sheepherder coffee, blue jay chatter, or moonlight sifting the trees. The music of silence drifts up from the vast, soundless sea. And in the flux and flow of soundless change unchanging, Adi Buddha dances, and I am happily lost in the dance of the gopis, where only poetry is real. I think a wonderful, wonderful tribute of Sam to Kenneth. So around 1977, Sam was very encouraging to me about my poetry and very supportive. He accepted my first manuscript for publication for Copper Canyon and then arranged for a grant from the National Endowment of the Arts, NEA, for me to sit type and do a limited letterpress edition of that book. It was an incredible opportunity for which I'm forever grateful to Sam. So I spent a winter with Sam and Tree in the print shop at Copper Canyon. The print shop was an old, Fort Worden was a World War I era Army fort. The print shop was the old blacksmith shop, and so I kind of like that idea. This is a poem that comes from that time. Waiting for the Key. There's a reference to some green trucks. That's the state park. Of course, Fort Worden is now a state park. It's the home of Central Arts Foundation. But I thought the particular transformation of the blacksmith shop to the poetry shop was something that needed to be commemorated. Waiting for the Key. This is called. Sam was late that day, probably a hangover. And I was that winter spending time in town, a little out of my element to do this project, and also feeling sorry for myself because my girlfriend had fled to Florida for the winter, or to Mexico for the winter. The first thin sunlight washes over the last scraps of the woodpile. Many small green trucks begin their curious rounds. Crows rifle the apple tree ghost, shadows wade the firs. Inside the old blacksmith shop, the poetry presses slouch like pack mules, awaiting the day's meager haul. On the warm wooden steps, I read the same letter over again. All the white military buildings are at peace, and a low mist rises from the winter grass. So I thought maybe I'd read a poem from that first book, Pawtrax, and this one's called Song. It's from out on the coast. By noon, the tide had erased all trace of our coming here. Driftwood crackled in the rusty tin stove. Our boots leaned and steamed. It was the shortest day. Mist clung to the ceiling of the world like a web, and you, like a white and slender fish, or a wave, ripple and break over me, as over the dull, cumbersome rocks, and send all the shore birds whirling in us. I thought a little springtime poem might be in order, and so this one is not where it should be. Oh, one for the dipper. Let's do this one, A Poet's Job. I know that's so much in the wrong book. There we go. 80. Poet's Job. In the early spring morning frost, two deer browsed from Crown Zellerback's holding over into Scott paper. A poet's job is a tricky one. And then this one for the dipper, the wonderful little water wren swims around, flies around underwater. Just saw some the other 3 days ago on the Dungeness River. One for the dipper. A little bit of, I think, maybe navigating rapids, maybe some metaphoric resonance for our time now. To be as sure and light-footed among rapids as the dipper, slate-gray puff of feather and song, twig-like dusky feet. Dip, dip on a sudsy rock, cheeks off upstream, no higher than spray. One yesterday, drinking delicate little beakfuls from a boulder mid-Dungeness river, wild with 3 weeks' rain. One of the other ways that Sam and I really connected was a mutual regard for Morris Graves, the painter Morris Graves. And Sam and I both wrote some poems kind of tripping off from Graves' paintings. Graves lived, I think a lot of you know, Graves lived for a while not far from here, out near Campbell Lake, and up on a rock, a cliff, a place he called The Rock, which I understand now from Bob Rose, there's a public land trust access trail beneath the cliff where you could look up and see the landscape that inspired Graves. He wrote he created some paintings through the war years of the 40s, and this is a poem that was a painting of his that was written in 1941, so I'm kind of taking off from that, using the titles of the painting as the titles of the poems. Varied thrush calling in autumn. The earth is a page of dark washed browns, where a bough and needles riffle in tense wind. A dozen brushstrokes give life to the shape of a bird in song. Its single pure note in a season darkening with war forms a broad wing shape of hope which contains it. Bird, wind, and season, the quiet flight of music sweetened by the coming cold. And this is another poem from another painting of Graves. It's a miraculous painting. Its title is "Each Time You Carry Me This Way." It's a play on a quote from the Puranas, the Hindu text, Hindu trilogy text. That quote comes from Vishnu in his boar incarnation, carrying the earth at the end of the Yuga. And in the Graves painting of this title, it's a heron zapping a little minnow in the shallows, close up with the beak at the moment, catching this fish. Each time you carry me this way, this transformation of form. For you and I have been both carrier and carried, hunter and prey, in our time among the moonlit water. Though the distance from shore to shore lessens with each passage, always the quiet bird waits attentive in the shallows at perception's edge. I woke one frost-lit night by a stream in a northern range, the stillness pierced by an owl's call that cut the dream of time like a blade. Stars held motionless. The night grew large, and who I was about to become called from a portal of darkened trees. Every time I carry you this way, Vishnu to the goddess Earth, the first dawn of the Yuga. Dawn breaks forever where a bird stands bowed at the edge of the world. The self is a hidden radiance there, gleaned from the depths, a small fish caught and carried into light. I think maybe I'll just finish up with a little short poem. And this is a part of a sequence of poems I wrote for my daughter. back when she was growing up. And this one is called Wild Animals. It was celebrating the year she got old enough to carry out the compost after dinner. And got to be fall and it started getting dark. So, wild animals. Dinner over, just past dark, and my daughter refuses to carry out the compost. There's wild animals out there. That's nonsense, I say, grabbing the pail and purposely leaving the flashlight behind. Past the porch light, total darkness. Then, just beside me, a deer startles and jumps noisily into the brush. A dozen steps later, heart still hammering, I lean to tip the pail and a low, toothy snarl rises from darkness a foot away. I'm halfway back to the house, compost scattered, before I realize raccoon. Christ, as the kitchen door slams behind me. There's wild animals.
We're talking about Morris Graves, and to be able to see his place was just fantastic. The lake, where they do residencies there. And Sam said to me, if I recommend you for this residency, you better follow through because you're going to get it.
That's our place in California.
Yeah.
Graves.
The lake. Yeah, I read a poem in the Circle today about part of my experience there. One more reader as part of this reading. Ian Boyden, artist, writer, translator, and curator, investigates relationships between the self and the environment, in particular, how art and writing can shape our ecology. Consistent across his productions are his interests in material relevance and place-based thought, as well as a deep awareness of East Asian philosophies and aesthetics. He studied for many years in China and Japan, although he'll never get into China again, based on his Walser work. He holds degrees in history of art from Wesleyan University in Yale. In addition to his independent projects, he collaborates with scientists, poets, composers, and visual artists. He's exhibited widely, including a solo exhibition at Suzhou Museum. His books, paintings, and sculptures are found in many public collections, including Reed College, Stanford University, the Portland Art Museum, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. We've had 2 opportunities this weekend to have Ian show us his amazing book that he did for Sam, of Sam's Habitations, which was a poem before the book Habitation. Sam showed this to me and was talking Ian up, what a genius he met at AWP, and then he showed me this book at his home in Port Townsend. He pulled it out on the bed. This was a book that goes for $10,000 and only a few places in the world have. He only made 11 of them. And I saw that book and I started to weep. It was the most beautiful book I've ever seen. And we've had a chance to see it again this weekend and have Ian discuss it and talk about the inks that he makes from shark teeth, fossilized shark teeth and the ear bone of whales. And without him, this fest wouldn't have happened like it has happened. It was his idea for the Samthology, his idea for both of the panels today, and they were brilliant success. His idea to do the workshop on the Inter-Island Ferry, which happens tomorrow at 9:30. Got to be there at 9 o'clock. This man is a brother. He was a confidant of Sam, a collaborator with him, and he really loves Sam. And he's got some stories to tell. I'm really grateful that he's here and he's going to get a chance to do this. Please welcome my friend Ian Boyden.
As I was sitting back there, looking up at this Cascadia festival, the most amazing thing is that inside of the outline of Cascadia, you can clearly see a very beloved person in this room. You just take off part of this panhandle here, and you can see the tip of the hat. And there's Paul Nelson running all through Cascadia. Let's say it's all like Vancouver Island, and that's Slaughter right there. It's going off through that. It's a beautiful image. Thank you, Paul. And for all you've done with this festival, I think a huge round of applause for Paul. I had a very long and really love-filled relationship with Sam, and a lot of our interactions involved me trying to find ways to surprise Sam in some way. And he was a very implacable human being. You know, he'd often be he'd sort of sit there and wait for his moment when he could hold forth. And so I always felt there was a bit of a challenge to upset that in my visits with him. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story of that, but before I do, I would just like to mention that there's been some really wonderful themes which have come up again and again throughout this last couple of days. I've been really struck by how many people have talked about self-immolation and fire. And that's a theme which so clearly, really goes to the very heart of Sam's own personal transformation. And another one which is there is the early Chinese poetic genius Lu Ji, who wrote the Wenfu. And the opening of the Wenfu has this amazing image. To carve an axe handle using an axe, the model is close at hand. And I don't have Sam's exact translation of that, but right near the end of his life, the poet Alexis Bernot, who was just mentioned here, became really interested in that translation that he made, and he began to translate that into French. And I believe that he's finished. Does anyone know if that's finished? It's going to be coming out in French soon. Fascinating history of translation right there, that we would have Lu Ji's Wenfu translated by Sam into English, and then that translation into French. So next it's going to be picked up, and pretty soon it won't be the Wenfu anymore. I wrote a poem which was called Study the Axe Handle, which was a poem that I wrote for Sam, and I'm going to read that. To study the axe handle, is to study the forest, how trees stand, how trees fall, and how to cause their falling, and what it sounds like when one falls into one's own shadow by another's hand. To study the axe handle is to study Lu Ji, 3rd century poet, author of the Wenfu, who was wrongfully executed for high treason, and who once wrote, "Things move into the shadows and vanish. Memory returns in an echo. Moment by moment, axe cut by axe cut, telling truth by truth as the foundations of one's own wrongful execution. The seedling just sprouted has already fallen as a giant tree. One limb is already the handle of another limb's demise. It has fallen at the edge of a name, of a child who has fallen, who is moving into shadows, filled with echoes, and the memory of vanishing. I wrote this poem for Sam while I was working on a big manuscript of poems which are based off of the names of children, Chinese children who were killed in the Sichuan earthquake, the 2008 Sichuan earthquake. There are over 5,000 kids that were killed in that earthquake, and I was amazed that within that, those 5,000 names, there were 14 of them that were named axe handle. In one variation or another. And so Study the Axe Handle happened to be one of them. And when I read that and began to write that poem, I realized that we have all around us people who are more or less our axe handles. They're people that we're studying, and that we lift up in our own hands, we carve, and make this long tradition that goes down through time that way. And that was so beautifully written in Snyder's poem, which, I don't know if any of you knew, Sam had prominently mounted on the wall of his kitchen, a hand-typed version of that poem that Snyder had given to him. So I sent this poem to Jayne Hirschfield and told her about kind of what I'd done, and she wrote back this hilarious note. She said, "Oh, Sam's gonna love this." She said, "You know, he goes back to the original Paleolithic axe." Right? Now I have something that I can surprise Sam with. So I went to his house. I told him I wanted to come over and have sushi and drink sake. And, you know, that's kind of all it took. You know, usually he would say yes. And I went over and I sat down with him and I read him the poem. Sort of did his thing, and then I told him the story about what Jayne had said. And when I told him that she had said that he went back to the original Paleolithic axe, this big smile spread across his face. He made really a special place in his heart for Jayne. And I then told him, I said, "Well, you know, I think that she's wrong." I said, "You only go back to the Neolithic axes because there are no hafted Paleolithic axes." Yeah, and then he frowned, you know, and he got really kind of upset with me, you know, like, how could you rain on my parade, you know? So then I pulled out of my bag this, and I'm going to just hand this, and you can pass this around. That's an Acheulean axe right there. That's about 500,000 years old. And so that evening, he and I sat around and we talked about poetry, and we talked about Lu Ji and the Wenfu, and ended up singing George Jones and all the groovy things you do with this particular stone axe. That's from northern Africa, what's today Mauritania. I wanted to read another poem. The axe. That was the first one that I wrote based on the axe handle. It's become a whole series of poems that forms a chapbook. And because Alexis Bernot wasn't able to make it to this event, I thought I would read the poem that I wrote to him. Each one of these poems is dedicated to someone who's involved in this idea in some way or another. And I think that Alexis really deserves a special moment here because he was such an important person in Sam's life. So this is a poem which is called "Become the Axe Handle." Kuru was the kid's name. And I read this poem here a few weeks ago when we went over and planted a tree in honor of Sam over in Fort Boyden. Digging the earth to plant a tree for a teacher who had died, my shovel hit something hard. Carefully scraping the soil away, I lifted an iron axe head into the spring light, felt its weight, ran my fingers over the blade dulled by rust, looked through the hole where the handle had rotted. A world brimmed there, my world and that of another. The world of mountain, of forge and hammers, of files and calloused hands, of being, time. When we swing an axe, we open a world of cleaving, and how we become in that world is who we are then and forever after. I continued to dig the earth, thinking about who buried that axe in the ground and why. What memory was buried there? When the wooden handle decayed, what was released? I uncoiled the roots of a young tree. Kneeling at this edge of its life, I thought about my teacher who implored us to wield words to counter war within our hearts. I slipped the axe head over one of the long roots, that the tree might grow to become a handle, holding this blade in the earth until it became a pocket of ochre and the tree was no longer its handle. Sam was really instrumental in encouraging me to take up translation from the Chinese, and he was very, very interested in my work, in particular involving Chinese dissidents and my work with Tsering Moser. So in honor of that, I'd like to read one of her poems this evening. This is a poem that Paul's also very fond of. And this is a poem which is called The Entire Night I Dreamt of Long Chen La. And it documents a history of an elephant that was given to the Dalai Lama. Let me just see if there's anything. Long Chen La, just so you know, Long Chen is the Tibetan name for the elephant, and La is a way of showing endearment. So my dearest elephant, I suppose, is how you could translate that as the name. Just make sure there isn't anything else here that you need to know. There's a place, the Dongzia Lukang, which is mentioned in here, and that was the elephant house. And I think that's going to be enough to get you through this. The entire night I dreamt of the elephant, Long Chen La. I didn't want to open my eyes, kept them closed, that this divine beast would not fade away as if it had never existed. I immediately wrote down what I saw, so I wouldn't forget this strange encounter linking me to the past as I fell back into this reality of smog and dust. I have to tell everyone, Long Chen La is the Tibetan term of endearment for the elephant, and this one in my dream came from a foreign land, somewhere beyond the Himalayas, walking the very path that His Holiness would later walk into exile. Its long trunk swinging back and forth, its big ears like fans, its 4 heavy limbs. All along the road, Tibetans were awed by this miraculous trace of a god, one of the 7 treasures. They pressed their palms together, overflowing with love, a spontaneous festival celebrating this bodily manifestation of the elephant god. Past generations of the Dalai Lamas let elephants dwell in the Dongzia Lukang, behind the Podrong Potala. This time, they asked the attendant, the one who spoke Hindi and wrapped his head in a white cloth, to soothe it, to dispel any longing for home, that it would feel safe and welcome. Every day at noon, upon hearing the conch sound from the highest terraces of the Potala, Long Chen La slowly accompanied worshippers as they circled its Anacortes. It drank from a well along the way, faced the radiant golden dome, and swung its trunk a few times as if in homage, as if bowing in worship. And so, this last elephant to be given to the Dalai Lama lived until the 1950s, when the world inverted. Then, as if it knew beforehand, as if it were unwilling to follow the old road once again, it refused to follow His Holiness and the 100,000 people who left their homes in sadness. And that time, when danger lurked everywhere, it stepped into the bardo. But before it arrived at the Kalachakra Mandala, its body white as snow, its 6 tusks pure and clean as one might see in a tanka. Long Chen La, like a Vaya Karana, fallen from the sky,
turned into written word. When I awoke from this dream, I had this vision. Through early morning light, a snowflake in the shape of the eternal wheel of life settled lightly on a monk's robes at Shari Monastery. They say there is a grain of dust at the center of every snowflake that falls, pulled as if by an irresistible force into the reality of smog and dust. And this one fell into the 1950s, when the world inverted. It is unbearable to bear witness to the true plight of Longchen La. Its demise at the hands of the occupiers was not like the ending of my dream, where it entered the Kala Chakra Mandala. My own delusion is far too immaculate. This last elephant was confined. Tall stone walls encircled the elephant's house. Its front leg was tied to a thick stone pillar. It was fed less and less each day. Its ration of barley was not enough. Its luminous black skin, which in the past had been rubbed with special oils, cracked open under the scorching sun, and sweat and grease oozed from a crosshatch of cuts. It is said Longchen La died before the Cultural Revolution, but how it dies, no one knows. When, at last, they opened the doors of the Dongxia Bukong, a giant skeleton lay there, an astonishment scattered upon the ground. But where the bones are now, nobody knows. It is said the elephant's house was demolished, turned into a restaurant, but the business was bad and failed. Could it have been because of the lingering smell, the stench of Longchen La's silent decay? After that, the site became an amusement park with model airplanes and model horses, but there was no replica of the elephant. The children's innocent laughter diluted grief and sorrow, diluted memory. And finally, it became a tea house. On sunny days, it fills with pilgrims who come to worship the Patala, a paradise for children and the elderly. I too have sat here many times, drinking sweet tea, eating Tibetan noodles, and of this, I knew nothing. That's Wozer at her finest, documenting the experience of living under the experience of colonialism as Tibet is thoroughly wiped off the map by the Chinese. And I think that one of the reasons that she and she really loves Sam and Sam loves her, they ended up writing poems to each other at the end, was because she's also a bioregionalist at heart. I think that anyone who really loves a place also ends up documenting exactly what happens there, what trespasses occur there, and tries to use poetry as a means for holding on to memory of what that site was. I think that's a really exquisite, gorgeous function of poetry. And so to that end, I would just like to end tonight by reading one of Sam's own poems. I hope I have it here. This is the poem that ends his book, Habitation. It's a poem which I think is very much written for Paul Nelson. Hold on, I gotta get this bigger. When it's bigger. Of Cascadia. I came here nearly 40 years ago, broke, half broken, having chosen the mud, the dirt road, alder pollen, and 100 avenues of gray across the sky to be my teachers and my muses. I chose a temple made of words and made of vow. I scratched a life in hardpan. If I cried for mercy or cried out in delight, it was because I was a man choosing carefully his way and his words, growing as slowly as the trunks of cedars in the sunlit garden. Let the ferns and the moss remember all that I have loved, or all that I have lost or loved, for I carry no regrets, no ambition to live it all again. I can make it better than it's been. I can't make it better than it's been or will be again, as the seasons turn and an old man's heart turns nostalgic as he sips his wine alone. I have lived in Cascadia, no paradise nor any hell, but both at once, and made, as Alita said, of the same material. A poor poet, I studied war and love, but Cascadia is what I am of. Thank you.